off by default? Do you want, what's your nickname by default? So NS defaults are good for things like that, configurable options that the user might change in the game. Settings is just another UI. A lot of applications, like an Evil Hangman, will have settings built into the application, for instance, on the flip side. And indeed, that's where you can store things like the preferred word length and number of guesses in an NS defaults through that API, which ends up writing a file into the iPhone or to the iPad or the like. But you can also write code that allows you to hook into the settings icon on the iPhone or the iPad, where you can move your settings there. It's really just a design decision. What people tend to do for simple settings, if you only have a few, they put them in the application itself. If there's lots and lots of settings, some people factor them out and put them under the settings icon on the phone. It's a little more annoying, though, because you have to exit the application and go to it to actually get at them. But you'll find that this is as easy as writing key value pairs to an object. So more on that with Evil Hangman. What's SQLite, if familiar?
Flat file SQL. It stores a SQL accessible database in a flat file.
Exactly. So a SQL, a structured query language, is a database language with which you can write information to a database and read it and use syntax that allows you to search the database fairly easily. You don't have to resort to linear search all of the time. And it's nice because you don't need a server. You don't need MySQL or Postgres or Oracle or anything like that. You just store it in a binary file in the same folder typically as your code. And what SQLite is, it's an API that lets you read and write from that file using select and insert and delete, if you're familiar with that feature of SQL. The catch is, in iOS, the SQLite library is implemented not in Objective-C, but in C, which means the code looks horrific. It's very useful, it's very powerful, but it's also a bit arcane. And so people typically use other constructs, a couple of which we've discussed. XML, meanwhile, or JSON, is typically used when transporting information these days across the wire. So property lists are XML, but if you were to have your own arbitrary format, typically that's for a game or a program that somehow grabs information from a server on the internet. These are very useful data formats for exchanging information. And then finally, there's core data, which is an Apple SDK that allows you to abstract away the notion of a database altogether and define your database schema, define the keys and the values, the relations among them, using their graphical editor to wire things up a little more high level. And you had a question here. Is it possible to query a regular expression in SQLite, simplified one? SQL supports like queries, where you can use a subset of Perl's regular expressions, or which are common in other languages as well. So sort of. Good question. All right, so let's go back over here, and let's go into tonight's sources, and let's go into plist. So I, in advance, downloaded the plist file earlier on my own computer over here. Not that one. So now if I go into plist and go into the distribution code here, we'll see some of the usual friends. And let me go into main.m. OK, no surprises there. Let me next go into appdelegate.h. No surprises there. Appdelegate.m. No surprises there. It seems to be handing off control now to viewcontroller.h. Really nothing going on there. Viewcontroller.m, finally. There's something going on in here. But let's wait. Let's go to the nib file. And for some reason, my example involves cities in California. So this has always been a stupid feature of Interface Builder. When you drag and drop a UI table view controller into an application, rather than show you your data or just blanks, they arbitrarily show you cities in California. Those are not in the application itself. It's like a screenshot of someone else's application, but mildly confusing. But if I now go back to my code, let's see what I'm doing. So recall that we looked at the master detail application earlier, which was a little complex, and I've stolen some of the simpler ideas from it just to implement the following application. If I go ahead and click Run up here, oops, let me quit the old simulator, and let me run this in the latest version of the simulator. It's going to pop open, and you might see some familiar words. So these are from a property list called small.plist, which I downloaded from the course's website. Recall that the project specification gives you a super short list just so you can tinker without worrying about hundreds of thousands of words. So that's just an XML file that I've literally dragged and dropped into the project, and somehow in code I'm opening this up. Yes?
I've noticed like every one of your projects, like all of these projects have warnings in them, or warnings ahead. Like Google, we have to get rid of all warnings for
Oh, yes, you should. It's because I made these on another computer, and that one, there we go. Yeah, so with things like this, I'll fix these and re-upload them so you don't see these little warnings. It's because the computer I was creating them on was a slightly different version. Short answer, your code should have no warnings. Therefore, do as I say, not as I do. But I will fix that. OK, so this plist file, I literally just dragged and dropped into the supporting files folder, but it's not really a folder. I could have put it anywhere into the project. And so that means all of the logic must be in this .m file. So let's see what's going on. This is my view controller class. I have chosen to implement this familiar method now, init with nibname bundle. And what am I doing in there? One, I'm calling the parent class's version of that method. So that's familiar construct, checking its return value to make sure it's not nil. And then I'm apparently loading words. So how do you go about loading an XML file, specifically a property list, from your application if you've dragged and dropped it in there or added it by going to File, Add File? Well, I apparently call nsBundle main bundle. So this is a way of saying to iOS, give me essentially the path to the default folder, the default root folder of this application. Then give me specifically the path for the following resource, quote unquote small, and what data type is it? plist. So this is a way of telling iOS, give me a file called give me a file called small.something. That something is plist because it's of type plist. And this helps it know how to load the file, whether it's a property list, a binary file, or some generic text file. Then I'm out doing this. On the left-hand side, what's going on here in this highlighted portion? Good. I'm creating a pointer to an NSArray object. And on the right-hand side, I'm calling NSArray alloc init with contents of file. So there's a bunch of different ways to do this. I have chosen to use NSArray's alloc method, and then the init method called inits with contents of file. And it turns out that if I read the documentation for that method, it just knows how to load that information into the file. But I thought NSArrays were immutable. In other words, I thought you couldn't change them. But I'm clearly initializing this one with words. How do we reconcile that? What's that? I never allocated it or initialized it. But I did allocate and initialize it here, right?
You haven't changed the array, and you just have a type NSArray pointer.
So that's OK on the left-hand side. But why is this not a mutable array? I'm adding stuff to it, which means I'm changing it, right? Yes, that's the key distinction. If you could never mutate arrays, you could never have anything in an NSArray. It would be a useless object. But in this case, we have an NSArray that's being initialized at the point of allocation with the contents of a file. So the fact that it's an NSArray just means I can't change it after this line of code. And that makes sense because if this application is just going to show this list of words, much like Evil Hangman is going to have a long list of words in its memory, you're not going to want to change it. You just want to have one copy of that lying around. And it's slightly more efficient to have the NSArray class instead of the NSMutable array because, one, there's less functionality. There's not the editing code related to it. And two, you protect yourself against yourself. You can't accidentally delete a word from your dictionary if you've said to the compiler, this is an immutable NSArray. All right, so lastly, I'm just remembering that pointer by assigning it to my property called words, and then I'm returning myself. So at this point in the program, I have loaded that property list into memory, stored it in a property, so now I have access to an NSArray that I can iterate over and do whatever I want. So the application now looks like this. It's a table of words, and I now somehow have to render 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 cells. But I don't proactively push the cells to the UI. I'm instead going to have the iOS is going to ask me, what do you want at this cell? What do you want at this cell? What do you want at this cell? Or rather, what do you want at this row, this row, this row? And I have to return a cell to it. So if I go back to the code, notice that we have this thing, number of sections in table view. So that's OK here because it's just one big table. There's not different groupings. As an aside, if I go back here, let me see if I can show you the opposite. If I go into settings, this is a UI table view. So if you've owned an iOS device, you've seen UI table views for years now. This is a UI table view with 1, 2, 3, at least 4 sections, each of which has some non-zero number of rows. So that's all we mean by sections. But the game we're playing, or the program we're using here, just has one such section since we don't see the gray. So what next? Actually, let me delete for simplicity since it's not necessary here. And now we have table view, cell for row at index path. When is this method called? When or why is this method called? What's that? When you try to get a cell and you pass in the index path, yes. So this is really the operating system is going to call this method, or more specifically, the controller is going to call this method, or rather, the view is going to call this method when I want to render a cell on the screen, and it's going to say what belongs at section 0, row 0. What belongs at section 0, row 1, row 2, row 3. And my job, as we saw earlier with master detail, is to return to this thing an object representing that row in the table with whatever text I want, whatever buttons I want inside. So we have this same trick using the reusable cells. I'm using quote-unquote cell again this time. If not, I instantiate it as needed. And then down here, I am initializing the cell as follows. 1, I'm setting its so-called selection style to be UI table view cell selection style none. What does that mean? It just means that when the user's finger clicks on this table view, like I'm doing with my mouse, nothing happens. It doesn't become blue. It doesn't get selected.
So UI table view is giving you rows, and you have to create cells.
Correct. It's asking me, what do you want here? What do you want here? What do you want here? And I have to hand it back the rectangular cell, effectively. Exactly. And then I'm setting the cell's text label text equal to be whatever is returned from the object at index row. So what's at index 0, what's at index 1, and then I'm passing that message to words so that I get the 0th object, the 1 object, 2 object, 3, and so forth. And if I change this, for instance, to that, semicolon, and rerun the application, what I should get, despite all of that effort to store data, is just the same string again and again and again. So that's truly a method that's being called. Finally, down here, this one's different. Table view number of rows in section. This is the method that that's going to be invoked when asked how many rows does section 0 have, so that iOS knows how many times to ask you for the cells. In this case, I have not hard-coded a value because I don't remember how many words are in the property list, and maybe it would even change with an update. So we pass in the count message to self.words, which gives me the array's length. Yes?
So in the case where you're passing through a file, we have an array that's not mutable.
Okay.
You're editing the actual file itself, like the plist itself, and you're keeping.
No editing has happened into the plist here.
No, but I'm saying in terms of like if you wanted to, if the plist had like more content in it,
Okay.
this would already account.
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly. This is good design because even though I could go to the application and I can go 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 5 words in my plist, I could just write return 5. The catch is that whereas it's reasonable to assume that my UI has one section forever because that's how I designed the user experience to be with just one big table view, no notion of sections, that in theory could change. And it's a poor design decision if not only do I have to update the property list in a year when I ship a new version with 10 words and not 5, but to also have to change it there. It's just inviting bugs and unmaintainability. So that's all. All right, so nice and sexier maybe, but let's actually do something where we interact with the glass of the screen and do something like clicking or dragging or pinching and see how we can add that element, particularly as you contemplate what you might want to do for your third and final project. So it turns out that iOS supports a whole bunch of gestures, and you're probably familiar with these naturally if you have a device like this, but they all reduce to some key class names. So we have things like UI tap gesture recognizer. This is the type of object that if you instantiate, you have the ability to detect that on an arbitrary portion of the screen, not necessarily right on top of a button, which is handled for you automatically. Pinch, which is doing something like this, often to zoom. Rotations, kind of twisting your fingers around, swiping left to right, up to down. Pan gesture, if you want to move something across the screen. And long press, if you want to click and hold for like a second or two, that too can be detected differently. And if you've used Google Maps or Apple Maps or the like, you've experienced a bunch of these different UI mechanisms. So how do we start doing that? Well, let me go into some code and our last project here for the evening and open up the one called